Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Sue, and on behalf of the Pamunkey Regional Library, welcome to today's program, Vegetable Garden Planning and Planting. This is the third in a series of programs developed in a partnership between the library and the Goochland Powhatan Master Gardeners Association. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few guidelines. This program will be recorded for future use, so please keep your webcams off if you do not wish to be recorded. Also, please keep your microphones off. The chat feature will be available, and there will be 2 breaks for questions. So please use chat to send your questions to us. We have 2 co-hosts today. First is Audrey Hirsch, who is a Goochland Powhatan Master Gardeners Association volunteer and chair of its Speakers Bureau. Today's presenter is Kaz Mock. Kaz's background in medical social work ignited a passion in her to focus on the prevention side of healthcare versus treatment. This interest led to a career in fitness and farming, including the transformation of her entire front yard in Powhatan into a vegetable garden. Kaz has been a master gardener for 3 years and has been growing vegetables for 5. She works for a local farm and 2 farmers market systems. Kaz says that she enjoys experiencing the immeasurable benefits of connecting local, hardworking farmers with the community. All right, let's get started. Here is Kaz Mock and Vegetable Garden Planning and Planting.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here and sharing an hour on a Saturday. I think I might be the only one with a bed behind me, so sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. Okay. Okay, here we go. I'll try not to provide too many disclaimers here, but I think I will always see myself as a novice when it comes to vegetable gardening. But there is certainly beauty, excitement, and humility in pursuing a passion in a field that's really ever changing, from new recommendations for turning over beds to different amendments to different insect pressure and weather. So my advice is just kind of to enjoy the ride and know it's a learning process. There's going to be a lot of trial and error, and just also enjoy getting your hands dirty and growing something that you're able to eat, because it's pretty awe-inspiring. Okay, also you'll notice these are pretty much all of my own pictures. So there's easy access, there's no copyright concerns. And it's also meant to tell you that this is very doable. If I can do it, you can do it. All right, here we go. Okay, how can this presentation hopefully help you? Well, I'm hoping it will inspire or maybe re-spark an interest in growing your own food. One thing about COVID, maybe one positive thing in the midst of this challenge, is that it's really highlighted the importance of being able to access quality food. And I think it's reignited this interest in growing your own, just for peace of mind and really quality of the food too. So as you can imagine, this topic is extremely broad, almost overwhelmingly broad. So this is going to be a bit of an overview to help get you started and connect you with more extensive resources. And you're always welcome to contact me later on too. And speaking of resources, so Audrey and I are part of the Goochland Powhatan Master Gardeners, and I see a lot of friendly, familiar faces on this call who are also Master Gardeners. So there's an email address that you can use here, and they can field your questions and engage in a lot of study and research to give you some answers. As Sue mentioned, there's a Speakers Bureau for presentations to groups. And you too can become a Master Gardener. The classes usually start in January, and I highly recommend this. There's all sorts of seasoned professionals, even local professors. And then of course you have your own local cooperative extension office. And then all the resources I list at the end are going to be coming from these extension publications. And so that's the address right there. Okay. All right, again, more of my home pictures here. Okay, so let's get started. Where to plant your garden. You know, some of this is going to be common sense, but we'll work our way through it. So obviously sun is going to be critical. 6 hours minimum, but really 8 or more would be ideal. You've really got 3 options to consider. You're going directly in the ground, raised beds, and pots. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons of each of those approaches. So we've been in Powhatan for about 5 years now. And prior to that, we lived in the city, and it was a home from the 40s, but it had been a dairy farm back in the day. So it gave me this impression I had this green thumb. And then I moved out to Powhatan, and it was new construction. So you can imagine what happened to our soil. All the topsoil was removed. The clay was compacted from all the heavy machinery. So you really have to look at your own land and the condition of your own soil. And you can do that through soil tests, which we'll get into. So in my case, I was stubborn, and if I got 2 acres, we're going directly in the ground. So what I ended up with is kind of a combination of going directly in the ground and a raised bed. So I have more mounded beds. And you can see I did this very inexpensively. They are lined by fallen trees from our woods. So I did till directly into the ground, but then I also added a lot of organic material and amendments to improve the quality of the soil over time. So again, it kind of depends upon your own unique situation. If your land has been treated poorly, or if it's fertile and it's great, that will kind of dictate which direction you go. In terms of size, a lot of that's going to be up to you. What's going to help you with ease of access? How much space do you have that's in a good location for sun, etc. Being new to using a tiller, it kind of got away from me. So most beds, at least in the market gardening world, tend to be around 30 inches in width. And so some tools and equipment have been kind of tailored to that size. But mine run probably more like 4 feet by 50 feet. So the pro to that is I have a lot of growing space. The con is that I'm jumping over the bed. You know, it's hard to straddle it to harvest. I usually tend to go around the beds in order to harvest. So you want to think about these things ahead of time. What else here? So raised beds. It's a great option if you have poor quality soil. The ones I have here, those are strawberries in February. So sorry, that's not too pretty there. But a lot of people go with 36 to 48 inches in width. The good thing about raised beds is you totally control the contents of the topsoil and the compost and the amendments. So you're not working with the land that was, that you've been given. You get to control the contents. But as a result, you're filling beds, and sometimes that can be costly, but so can going directly in the ground too. So, and you have to think about materials and things like that. But they are great for ease of access. You can sit on the sides of them to weed and to harvest. So they're pretty practical in that sense. Also, they tend to have better drainage because, again, you control the contents. The soil will warm faster. So a lot of benefits there. And then lastly, there would be pots. So pots are great for, again, ease of access. If you have limited space and time, frankly, you can often put them on a back deck if it's sunny, and then you've got easy access to bring your harvest into your kitchen. And I included in the list of resources one called vegetable gardening containers. And that's where it's going to give you more specific information on depth of the soil for, lettuces and spinach and things like that versus peppers and tomatoes and your larger sort of plants. So know that there's all sorts of ways to grow your own food. Okay, continuing with where to plant your garden. So again, this is our modest little system over here. That was a very cheap sort of screen door. And then we've got some pretty thin posts, but then some larger posts on the corners and in the middle on the sides. So if you're somewhere like Powhatan, there's a good chance you're going to have problems with deer. So in our case, we just have some plastic netting. It's about 8 feet tall. You can probably barely even see it in the picture. And that's a good thing. When we look out our window, we're not seeing that. We're just seeing the garden. And it has been effective for deer. Keep in mind too, you may need fencing below the ground level too, to try to ward off your voles and moles and rabbits. I found our dogs are rather helpful with the voles. That's just a recent experience I won't elaborate on. Other things to think about: proximity to water, tools. Do you have a shed with gardening tools? Do you have a rain barrel that you could use for water access at your house? Where's the spigot outside of your house? You want to make this as easy as possible. That way you'll do the work and you'll get out there and enjoy it. Other things to think about: will you be hand watering? You saw my drip irrigation set up in that first slide. Think about how you would set that up. Neighbors, that may be a funny one to throw in there, but if you are planning on going strictly organic or using organic methods, are you right next to neighbors that have a conventional farm, or they're spraying their yard on a regular basis? It's just something to think about. And then how your landscape can change over time. That small shrub or tree is going to grow. In 5 to 10 years, maybe your sunny spot is gone. So it's just a lot to think about ahead of time, but it's better to do it then versus to go to the trouble and then you've got to make some changes. And I wanted to point out something in this last slide: walkways. Plan for those ahead of time. You'll see between my 2 beds there, I have a narrow pathway just for me to walk, so I'm not stepping on the beds. But outside of those 2 beds, I have large walkways which can accommodate wheelbarrows, lawn mowers, things like that. Don't worry, we'll get to some question time here. All right, so how are you going to determine the condition of your soil? So luckily, you can obtain a soil test from your local extension office. It is very inexpensive and very easy to do. This form right here, I hope I don't mess up by taking us there. Maybe I shouldn't. That is, oh, here we go. Let's do it. Okay, this is an example of the form. You'll give some identifying information. You'll kind of name the bed to give yourself an ID number. And then it gives you some specific instructions on how to collect that sample.
Kaz, we're not seeing the form, just FYI.
Oh, thanks. Because I would be doing that this whole time. Okay. All right. Well, this sample form is listed in the resources at the end. Thanks for the heads up. And this is an example, kind of takes out some identifying information at the top. But this is an example of soil test results I got for my garden a few years ago. I'm not an agronomist, so I'm not going to go into tons of details about this in terms of micro and macronutrients. But one important piece of information is this soil pH right here. And most vegetables do best between 6 and 7. There are some exceptions with ones that are a little more particular, but you can see somehow I kind of hit that 6.5 early on. And the reason you need to be concerned about that is if it's out of range, then the nutrient uptake by your plants could be diminished or even locked up. So that's an important one to pay attention to. And you can see at the bottom here, they gave me specific fertilizer recommendations. So that was helpful too. And it kind of tells you where you fall with some of these macro and micronutrients. And then this is another example. I also used a local kind of independent resource here, and they gave me some pretty extensive information, especially when it came to recommendations down here at the bottom, all of which I did take on. And you can see the pH was at 6.3 during this test. And what's great too about them, that there were agronomists on hand that were very accessible to me to field some of my questions. You know, what else could you use for fertilizer versus what they recommended, those sorts of things. So it's just two resources to mention. All right, moving on to the soil basics and preparing your beds. So I'm going to credit Tim Olweiler. He's an extension agent within the state who kind of nicely summarized some of these tenets for us that I stole. The first one is always keep your soil covered with life. So if you think through that, why is that important? And hopefully my picture here sort of shows that. I've got some sweet potatoes and some kale, a little bit of gaps in the kale. I've got some okra and I don't know what's back there, maybe some beans growing on a trellis. So hopefully this depicts a lot of these tenets within this picture. So what's great about keeping your soil covered with life, and there's so many benefits to it, this is kind of an accepted practice, it does help with weed suppression. You can see if, and we'll talk about planting intensively, if you have this canopy of growth, then it's really going to suppress weeds from being able to grow within it. You can see some here and there, but it can help with limiting erosion. You know, that's key too. Maintaining moisture. We'll talk about cover crops. They're ideal for keeping something living in the soil and keeping that root growth in there too. That's really important. And you know, even tarps have been used to help prepare beds. It will suppress and kill the weeds and give you a nice clean bed to start with. So that's another idea. Engaging in minimal disturbance. I will tell you in the past 10 years, there's been this huge shift to a no-till approach to vegetable gardening, and I guess other gardening too. And I really believe in that. So that means something as simple as you and your guests and your dogs and your kids don't step on the beds. There is important microbial life going on in there, and you want to do everything you can to protect this living soil that you've been nurturing. Back to this no-till idea, keep in mind you are likely going to have to break ground with a tiller, but there are other methods for that too that we'll talk about a little bit. But the idea is you're staying off the beds. If you do keep deep tilling, there's been a lot of research about how you can destroy those microorganisms in the soil. And the bottom of the till zone with those tines can create a hard pan, which is the opposite of what you want. You want loose soil for those carrots and radishes to dig and drill down in there. And there are less invasive methods to kind of aerate the soil. It could be a broad fork, it could be a pitchfork, things like that. It could be thick layer of compost. It could be the cover crops that die off in the winter and you plant right down into them. So a lot of options there. You want to maximize your living roots, which is again, just protecting that symbiotic relationship that you have between the plants and those beneficial microorganisms. And then there are so many reasons to grow diverse plants, right? It's less inviting to insects. There's different nutrition demands upon the soil. You've got those heavy feeders, you've got those light feeders. And frankly, it's good for your health and good for the soil to grow a diverse array of crops. Okay, hopefully you're still with me here. Okay, how to prepare your beds. So I kind of got into that a little bit. There is a tiller. I would recommend renting one versus purchasing one. They are big and unwieldy if you have to store that somewhere. But you don't have to have a tiller. You can rely on a shovel, especially if you're going small. You can read up about all sorts of options out there for breaking ground and preparing a bed. There's double dig methods. There's this lasagna mulching style. You can turn it over with a shovel and lay down that tarp like I mentioned. So a lot of ways. You don't need to be intimidated by it. There is a good chance, just being in Virginia, you may have that heavy clay soil, which often runs acidic like mine. It may require quite a bit of amendments and organic matter, depending upon the condition of your soil and your soil test results, of course. But you do want to make sure that top foot is nice and loose, which again can be done through broad fork, pitchfork, something like that. So raised beds, So to prepare for a raised bed, there's some similar methods there, but what you can put down on the grass or whatever it may be, you can put down cardboard, which is free, newspaper layers to kill that grass and get ready for your bed, layers of landscaping fabric, if that's the route you want to go. And then, of course, you're doing a combo of topsoil and compost. You're getting soil tests done to get yourself off to the best start that you can. So we could probably do 8 of these presentations on compost alone, right? So look for this resource at the end called Backyard Composting. You don't have to do a perfect job at this. Our growing space is big enough that we can't rely on our own compost alone. We have to add some from hopefully a reputable local source, which has been hard to find. But read this resource about how you can make it at home. You can see, again, we go inexpensive. This is free pallet wood. This is leaves that are decomposing in here that we chopped up and that we turn over. And then you have the option of a turnable compost bin. That's where we put our kitchen scraps, and we add some leaves and some of our grass after cutting, that sort of thing. So it doesn't have to be an elaborate setup. We do happen to have chickens, so we use their aged manure and bedding, and we add that too. And then we get aged cow manure from a neighbor. So you get resourceful. We also have a worm bin. There's a lot of information through the extension office on how to keep a worm bin. I'll dispel some myths. There's no gross smell associated with it. Our worm bin is in our kitchen, and we add food scraps in there and some paper, and it's been very easy. So we get to benefit from their waste as well as the worms themselves when we take them out to the garden. Okay, we're finally at questions, but you have to take in this picture because it's hilarious. So this is year 1. This was our compacted clay. They look like monster hands, but they were carrots reaching that hard pan and stopping and spreading out and twisting. And then just a couple of years later, just from continuing to add organic matter to the soil and loosen it up, they look like real carrots. So, okay, I'll try to field some questions.
Sorry, I was chatting away. I was on mute. No questions so far, other than a comment that your vegetable garden is gorgeous.
Thanks. Okay. This is another slide to be like, see, you can do this too. Don't get discouraged. This is where I started. Look at that. Okay, back at it. Crop planting. Okay. This part can be kind of fun. And, it's the middle of the winter, maybe the beginning of the winter, and you got to get organized and you got to start planning then. I don't know if any of you experienced this, but with COVID, it was really challenging to get seeds. So, I was ordering in December this last year just to make sure I got in there. So you want to find a reputable seed company that provides a lot of growing information. And I'll give you a sample packet of that. We'll get to that. It is hard to find truly local seeds. I think I kind of went into that a little naive. So it's great to start seed saving yourself. I would do some research on that, and I do have a handout about that at the end, because it can differ by crop, and you really want to prioritize those hardy resistant plants. Those are the ones you want to keep. So there is a bit to it, but that's a way to have truly local seeds, and you're kind of in control of it. And then your plants from open pollinated seeds are going to be the best for seed saving. And, it's a lot to go into, but you can read some resources at the end. And in terms of what and how much, well, plant what you and your family like to eat, and in the amounts according to what you're going to do with it. Are you sharing with, extensive family? Are you sharing with neighbors? Are you going to try to sell at a roadside stand? Plant your quantities according to that. But I do highly recommend you learn what you can grow well. That's part of this trial and error, which can be a lot of fun. I've grown peanuts for 4 years, and I've learned that a jar of peanut butter should at least be $45. And so I am done growing peanuts. It is super labor intensive and they're very accessible. So you're going to learn over time, what do you enjoy growing? What do you like to eat? You want to set yourself up for success. If you're among the 6% of the population who likes okra, like myself, that is super easy to grow. Radishes are easy, sweet potatoes, mustard greens, arugula. Set yourself up for success if you're new to this, and grow what you love to eat, what gets you excited. And I love eating zucchini. It's one of my favorite vegetables, but in this area, I'm gonna have squash bugs. So every year I say, I'm not gonna grow squash bugs because honestly, they diminish the joy I experience when I go out in the garden. I'm killing their eggs, I'm killing them as adults. So you wanna factor that into it too. So you wanna make a map for each season and keep a journal if you wanna learn from your trials and errors. And then you wanna live by this calendar. I'm afraid to bring it up now, but they have done all the work for you based upon your zone, and most of us are going to be in 7A on this call. They've done the work for you of when you plant what. So don't feel like you have to research that. This is at the bottom of the, and it's listed on the library website. This will give you everything you need to know when you put what in the ground, and even when you transplant what. So I would live by that, make life easier on yourself. And then you'll get creative too. If you're big into some of the summer vegetables, we'll learn what you can sneak in before you plant the tomatoes and peppers. You could do radishes that will grow in about 4 weeks to be harvested. So you'll learn as you go along. Okay, rotation. I think everybody kind of knows about crop rotation. There's a lot of benefits to it and a lot of reasons to do it. It can help with decreasing insect pressure and the risk for disease to take over overall. An easy example of this I read recently is just rotating root veggies with leaf veggies and then fruits. Some people will say you can keep something in the same spot for 2 or 3 years. I tend to rotate every single year. I never plant anything in the same spot. You can rotate heavy and light feeders, things like that. And keep in mind with those heavy feeders especially, you're gonna have to replenish and amend after each season because they've taken all those nutrients from the soil. Companion planting, there's a real extensive handout about that at the end. I'm not the expert on that, but it's a phenomenal chart that they give you of what's a companion and then what's kind of incompatible to plant together. And what's good about that is you're diversifying soil nutrient demands from the plants, again, hopefully reducing pest problems and increasing yields for a given space. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the 3 sisters method with corns and beans and squash. You've got the tall corn and the beans are vining up along it, and you've got the squash on the ground. Some people will even plant, this is kind of related more to insects, but they'll plant a trap or a sacrificial crop because they know that's going to attract all the bugs, and they'll knowingly sacrifice that crop in order to kind of take care of the bugs. Height and shading, this is kind of common sense stuff. If you're going to plant that okra I talked about, or corn, or something with the trellis like beans or peas or something, you got to be aware of what sort of shadow that's going to cast on the other plants. So you got to make sure you're planting that in the right spot. And intensive planting. So I included this picture of lettuce. I probably went a little overboard on this last year, but I talked about that canopy that prevents weed growth. If you can get the plant's edges touching one another, then that's ideal, not only for suppressing weed growth, but also just to give you the most of the crop that you can grow. Again, this is a little bit tight over there, but I think you get the idea. So it really just helps with high yield, making the most of your space. And then lastly, attracting pollinators. We do keep bees. You probably saw our little hive out there. So you're going to need them if you're going to have a successful vegetable garden. Doesn't mean you have to have a hive, but throw in those plants that are going to attract pollinators. You see I think that's a Mexican sunflower up top, and then you've got bee balm down there at the right, which is a funny looking plant. I will say, as a side note, we did African blue basil last year, and it turned into a huge bush. And I literally would see bees on every single bloom. So that would be something I'd recommend just from personal experience. Okay, continuing with crop planting. Again, we could talk cover crops for hours. In general, it seems like mixes seem to be your best bet. And so many of the seed companies out there have phenomenal mixes. They're usually pretty easy to grow. You got to kind of work on the timing of it. You know, they're going to take up growing space, but I think it's worth it. You can do ones in the fall, and you can do some in the spring. So you can see I still have okra going back there. And then I've got my cover crop, and then I've got some zinnias there. So I think mine had hairy vetch and clover and rye. The legumes are always good to throw in there as they're, you know, considered nitrogen fixers. But it's kind of like what we talked about earlier. You want to keep something growing in the soil at all times. And this is a great option because, you know, it can protect from erosion. But the good thing is you can incorporate this biomass into the soil. So there are a lot of different ways to do that. You can only plant something that's considered winter killed. So in the winter time, by the time you're in February, March, this is all going to be dead on top. And you can, some people have had luck planting directly into that dead biomass, or you could incorporate it into the soil with maybe a pitchfork. You can put compost directly on top. You can rake it all off and put it in your compost. So a lot of options for how to use that. They have so many uses that they're worth planting. And you can see I got creative there on the right. I had a cover crop planted, but I also incorporated some daikon radish, and you can see how they stand out there. Those drill down into the dirt and the soil, and it'll help if there's compacted clay and help kind of loosen up the soil. So I did kind of a combo, and they're edible, and they're not going to pop back up like a weed or something like that. So that might be a good option for you, especially if you have compacted clay. And then one thing I didn't mention too, you know, you could still put the tarp over it as a means to kill it. You can mow it down with your lawnmower or a weed eater, or again, kind of leave as a mulch on top and plant directly into it. Okay, I think we're at another break here. There's some okra for all of you out there who are fans. It has a pretty flower. Any questions?
No questions. We can keep going.
Okay, wow. This is very one-sided so far. Okay. Okay, here's an example of that seed packet. And I apologize, it's hard to know the experience level of all of you on the call here. So I'm sorry if I'm breaking down things too much, or I don't know, hopefully it's relevant and you're getting something out of it. Okay, this is a good example of a seed packet. So we know it's curly kale. We know from the front here, if all goes well, you could be harvesting this within 45 days. It gives you a little description. And on the back here, we have to move the pictures here. There we go. It breaks down the seed depth, which I'm sure a lot of you know, that's really often just based upon the size of the seed. And a lot of them are tiny. This is a tiny little circular one, so you're not going very deep in the ground. Space between the seeds that you're planting, ideal temperature of the soil for germination, hopefully how long you have to wait before germination occurs. And then when you thin those plants originally from this spacing, you're looking at a pretty broad range there. So keep in mind, we talked about intensive planting. So a lot of times I'm going to go with a lot shorter distance in there, hoping to form that canopy like we talked about. So what's nice too, we'll talk a little about sowing directly in the ground versus transplants. But you can see with kale, they're making it pretty clear that you've got the option to do either with kale. And I do both. I'll normally get things started indoors, and when I'm transplanting that, I'm planting some seeds directly in the ground. Gives you some growing and fertilization tips and things like that. Okay. And sometimes I forget to mention, you can buy established plants. That's okay. You don't have to take on seeds and transplanting and all that. You can buy some plants and put them in the ground and make that easier for yourself. Okay, so let's talk about it. Direct sowing versus transplanting, meaning you're just planting directly in the ground with a seed, or you're starting indoors. So let's talk about plants that are pretty common for direct sowing. So carrots, they are tiny little seeds. Good luck ever starting those indoors. Carrots, radishes, arugula, collards, those are all good just to plant directly in the ground, and you should have some pretty good results from those. I can't stress enough how easy radishes are. So if you like them, go for it. It'll be simple. Versus transplants, that would be your tomatoes, your peppers. I tend to do it with lettuce too. But again, you're going to have those seed packets for some guidance as to the best strategy. So why do people transplant? Well, a lot of reasons. One is you get a head start on the season, which is nice, right? They're going to grow up in this ideal controlled environment, and it increases your chances of success with growing that vegetable. It doesn't have to be some elaborate setup. My system has grown a little bit since this picture. You can see I was preparing with those additional trays down there, but this was a grow light purchase from Amazon. It was probably $65, and I have some trays which are very inexpensive. I do tend to use a warming pad to help heat up the soil for that ideal germination temperature. And then it's a process of, and I'm sure you've heard of this, of potting up, of hardening off. When they get to be a certain size, you're going to get them into a larger pot. You're going to expose them to the outdoors, maybe a few hours at a time. I will tell you, it may be hard to let go of the babies and then put them in the ground, but that is the ultimate goal. And you're doing that, some people would say after one set of true leaves. I tend to wait for 2 sets of true leaves before I transition them outdoors and then into the ground. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on grow lights. You can do some research too, or I'm happy to share with you what I have, but there's full spectrum fluorescent. There's LED, which is going to use less energy, but it's going to be quite a bit more pricey. But again, you can always buy established plants, and then you're putting those in the ground. Succession planting. This is important. I always do this too. So basically every 2 to 3 weeks, you're starting a new batch up until it doesn't make sense anymore with the growing period. So that's going to enable you to have food for a longer period of time. But it kind of makes sense for some plants more than others. For instance, if you're doing a bunch of lettuce where I call it cut and come again, where you're just taking off leaves at a time, well, then that for your family, that might be sufficient. That's going to serve you for a while. But those radishes that are giving you radishes every 4 weeks, well, then maybe every 2 weeks, you're popping some more in the ground. So again, you'll have a longer growing period and give you more food. And same thing with carrots. I mean, anything that you're going to pull out of the ground and you're done with it, you may want to consider planting something 2 to 3 weeks after that initial planting. And then water. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard, you're looking for about an inch a week, and that includes rain. So I'll show you in this next slide kind of what we're doing. We have a rain barrel, set up with the gutter and the downspout here. So that's great for hand watering. And then on the right, we have an irrigation system. So one of these we use for manual watering. And then the other 2, you saw those initial tubes, the irrigation system in that very first picture. So it takes the worry and planning out of it. We have it timed to go off a certain time each day. I do have to go out there and manually override it and turn it off if we're getting a lot of rain. So you want to keep that in mind too, but it makes life a lot easier having that in place. And you want to shoot for more thorough watering directly into the soil versus the leaves. That's just something to think about. And even with transplants, I have really transferred over to putting water at the base of those trays versus watering from on top, just to try to reduce the possibility of disease and too much moisture. So in my mind, it kind of applies to transplants too. So your pots and your raised beds are going to dry out the fastest. So they're going to need the most water. And then those raised beds in the ground are going to need a little bit less. Okay. Okay, so getting into the planting and ongoing care, these are the two pictures that aren't mine, clearly, the two tools down there. Okay, fertilizer, we could talk forever about that. And again, not an agronomist over here, but I would look at it as being based upon your soil test and even the unique needs of certain crops. So rely on those seed packets, do some self-study, reach out to the extension office, because it's going to differ for a tomato in July versus some lettuce in April. So something to think about, inorganic or these human-made fertilizers. I know there's a lot of questions on that, even in my mind too, for sure. They usually have a higher nutrient content, and they're readily available, but they're not going to do anything to enhance the soil structure. So it's something to keep in mind when you're choosing fertilizers. They could damage earthworms and some of that healthy soil life if they're not applied correctly. There are natural fertilizer sources. Certainly your compost, your animal manures. I mean, the list goes on and on. Bone meal, blood meal, fish meal, seaweed, kelp. Just kind of do your research on that and see what's going to be the best fit. And again, pay attention to those soil tests and ask questions about your results related to those macro and micronutrients. So those natural sources, they may take a little longer to release those nutrients, but there's going to be this bacterial and fungal activity that it promotes, and it is going to improve the structure and of course the organic content of your soil. So it's something to think about. Let's see, weeding options. So I have to admit, I was a hand weeder for a long time, and now I'm a big fan of this stirrup hoe. That's the one on the left here. And you can see it's got a blade at the bottom. You can stand upright and kind of drag this across the soil surface. The important lesson that I've learned is to use it for prevention. When you see small weeds, they're very easy to get up with the stirrup hoe, but I will even rake it across soil, knowing that seeds are going to come up. So I use it as a preventative sort of tool too. And then the one on the right is similar. You've got that blade kind of on the back side of the wheels, but it enables you to push it while it's kind of digging up those weeds. The thing I like about the one on the left, since I do tend to plant rather intensively, it's small and it's easy to get around my vegetable plants. So it just kind of depends on what you prefer. And you can see that's one of our chickens there. I know my daughter could tell you its exact name. I'm going to call that one Dark Wing because I know that's one of them. I mentioned, like in terms of pest control, I mentioned that you can have that sacrificial crop that you know is attracting bugs. Sometimes I'll leave, like they're going to target plants that aren't doing well. Sometimes I will leave it there and they can go to town on that plant. I do a lot by hand. I'm pretty protective of our soil and the earth and our bees. So I tend to do a bunch by hand. And I know this sounds maybe ideal, but if you follow a lot of these tips, I'm optimistic that you're not going to have the insect pressure that you would otherwise. So it should put you in a better spot. Again, kind of having that healthy soil and those healthy microbes should discourage bugs and weeds and things like that. And then keep in mind the other practices we talked about, the crop rotation, the diversity in the plants that you grow. There are organic and non-organic sprays, but again, I tend to rely more on my planting practices as well as kind of some manual control. Okay, so this is all of those resources that I really encourage you to read. This first one here, I sure wish I read it when I was planning this presentation because it's so extensive. I kind of found it late in the game. There's all the things I mentioned, collecting the soil sample, vegetable gardening in containers. This is that planting guide that everyone really needs to tap into and use. healthy soil, compost. So I listen to a lot of really nerdy farming podcasts. So if anybody wants to contact me for those, it's a great way when you're driving or working out in the garden to get some education. So I'm happy to share any of those. But it's basically all the things that we talked about in the presentation. And this is on the library website. Just looking at the time here. And there you go. Thank you and happy growing. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we do have several questions.
Okay.
So first, regarding your grow light, do you have a rule of thumb on how closely you place the light to your seedlings, such as 2 inches above versus 4 inches? She says she's read conflicting advice. And how many hours a day is it on?
Oh, those are great questions. I have to admit, last year was just easy as pie. And now with these fancy grow lights I have, I'm struggling a little bit too. So my understanding, and I'm sorry you've seen conflicting info, so I hope this doesn't confuse you more, but I do tend to start about probably 3 inches away. And then you're moving it up as those plants get taller. I went from one simple little grow light, and now I have this beaming 4-light system. So I'm still learning with you on that. But I would go around 3 inches in the beginning and then raise it up. And then they'll get tall enough that you're then bringing them outside most of the day and then transplanting them into the ground. Was there another question with that besides height?
How many hours a day is it on?
Yeah, so I do have mine set on a timer, and it is about 12 hours a day.
Okay. Next is a question from me. I have a question about what you actually use for your cover crops in the fall and in the spring.
Yeah, so I only do one in the fall, and I think I mentioned what I do. It had hairy vetch, it had pea, it had crimson clover, it had ryegrass. I think that's it. So I have done most recently a mix from Johnny Seeds, but I'm kind of rethinking my approach because, for instance, hairy vetch and sometimes the peas will come back on you. The peas I kind of like, the hairy vetch I'm kind of over. I don't want them out there with all the vegetables. So I am somewhat considering only planting ones that are winter kill. And that way, you know, when I'm ready in February, March to start turning over the beds, I'm going to have that biomass sitting on top that I'll probably incorporate into the soil with something not too invasive of a method. What about you? What have you tried? And I don't tend to do a spring one just because I'm trying to grow so much, and it's hard to spare that space when I don't have a super large growing space. So what about you?
I've done, let's see, this year I have some daikon radish out there for particularly compacted areas.
Yeah.
And in the past, I've done some buckwheat, and I really liked that. I did ryegrass, and I don't think I'll do that again because it's really hard to get out of the ground.
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, it was great for the soil and all, but oh my goodness, I felt like I was digging a whole new crop of weeds. So I don't think I'll do that again.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that because I've had the same problem with the ryegrass, and I won't do that one again either. And I think I mentioned during the presentation, I like to use daikon radish too, for the same reason, just constantly kind of combating the clay soil out here.
And so my next question personally, and I hope no one minds that I'm asking all these, have you had any experience with floating row covers over your garden?
Great question too. Yeah. So there's a lot of options for the home gardener where you don't have to invest in the high tunnel or the greenhouse. I do have row covers, and there are different ones out there. Some are just used more for insect prevention and keeping them covered. I thought about doing that for zucchini, but I do have some that enabled me to keep some crops over the winter. I had it over my mustard greens, over my kale, a few other things, and I have had good success with them. It's a great way to extend your growing season. so yeah, I enjoy doing that. And this is kind of a weird thing to share, but I'm always looking for inexpensive tips. I didn't have a lot of hoops to use for structure because I didn't want to put the cover right on the plants, especially things like mustard greens because they're really tall. So I was turning over tomato cages and kind of sinking them into the ground, and it provided enough of kind of a canopy there so it wasn't compressing the plants. And I made the mistake years ago of telling my mom if she heard of any tomato cages that people needed to give away, I probably have 50 of them. I thought I'd go to like a trellis system at some point. I'm like, nope, I got to use these things forever. So I've also used them as hoops for that cover cloth. Just a thought.
Another question from Miriam. She would like to know if yellow squash is a good alternative to zucchini in that it's less susceptible to bugs.
You know, I haven't tried, but I will tell you, I get them with winter squash. I get them with melons. So my gut kind of says it may not help. I am going to try. Have y'all ever heard of this tromboncino or tromboncino? It's like a squash that wraps around, to me, more like a kind of a French horn, but I guess a trombone. I'm going to try that. They claim that it's a little more resistant, or I guess less attractive really to squash bugs. So I'm not optimistic about the yellow squash, but you could try it, and you could try this insect version of cover cloth because it's going to let the sun go through and it's going to let water come through. But it will provide some sort of shield. So I'm probably gonna do zucchini again, and I'm gonna try that this year. But then you have to get it off when the flowers come because they need to be pollinated. So that's something to think about. Good question. Let me know how it goes.
I've actually started thinking of zucchini as a sacrificial crop to attract the squash bugs there rather than to melons and other things.
That's not a bad idea. I think I've inadvertently kind of done that most years. Yeah.
And that's all we have. Does anyone else have any questions before we sign off for the day? Not seeing any.
Okay. Well, I know Sue has this last slide. I don't want to rush anyone, but I want to make sure I get that up so she can have that time.
Well, Kaz, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. You shared a lot of great information. I know I came into it with a list of questions and I was able just to mark through them. You covered every one of them. So I really appreciate it. And I think everyone has benefited from your knowledge and your enthusiasm. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to let everyone know that if you know someone that wasn't able to be part of today's program, it's accessible from the library's website by selecting our virtual programs for adults or by clicking on the link to our YouTube channel. And also, as Kaz mentioned, there is access to her list of resources there as well. Don't forget that the library has great resources for gardeners in its branches and through its digital library. So you see the slide. We'd like you to please join us for the next program in our series. It'll be Selecting Plants for Landscape Design, which will be held on Saturday, June 12th at 11 a.m. and registration will open soon for that. So thank you all for joining us today and see you on June 12th.